Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all. This is another edition of the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. Midway through the week here, it is Wednesday, May 29th, coming to the end of May, believe it or not. Try not to believe it, actually, because before you know it, it'll be back to September. But I don't want to depress you too much. I am actually on the road today. I am, as I was promoting last week, in Calgary doing an event for my own book, which officially was released yesterday. But that is not the only political biography to hit the shelves this week. As it happened, and I had no idea this was going to happen when I was working on my book, but I shared a release date with a new book about Justin Trudeau and his turbulent reign, as the subtitle says. It's called The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau. It's written by longtime journalist Stephen Maher, and it's I think a very helpful companion piece to my own work on this. So I thought I'd bring Stephen on the show. We'd have a chat about this. It's a great book. Congratulations, Stephen, and thanks for coming on today.
Kind of you to say that. I've been enjoying your book.
Well, I'm glad, and we have different publishers, so this isn't just some elaborate publicity stunt that the publisher concocted, just in case people were getting suspicious. I obviously, we don't know what the next election is going to look like for sure. We can look at polls though, and I think that the general story here is that this is the decline of Justin Trudeau and the rise of Pierre Poilievre. Now, again, there are a whole bunch of asterisks and caveats there, but let me ask you about that trajectory for Justin Trudeau, because this is a book and I'd say a premise to a book that would have seemed just so foreign about a decade ago when he was the sexiest thing in politics. He had momentum, he had energy, he had this Obama-like quality about him. Where and when did it go so wrong?
Well, he had about a year of where I wrote in the book that Ottawa felt more like a pageant ground than a scene of grim partisan struggle, right? For that first year, there was a polling number that struck me that 44% of people after the election said that they supported him, which was more than the people who voted for him. So even people who didn't vote for him felt optimistic and kind of caught up in this new charismatic figure. He was getting positive coverage in Vogue and the Daily Telegraph and all over the world. He seemed like he could do no wrong. And then you have a period. The first big thing was the trip to the Aga Khan's Island in the Caribbean, where he seemed to show poor judgment in making that trip. He had to apologize for it. It was followed by a disastrous trip to India, and then the SNC-Lavalin matter, where he lost two prominent female cabinet ministers and two of his most senior staffers, Gerald Butts and Michael Wernick. So that was sort of the beginning of a period of difficulty. Later, you had the blackface matter and foreign interference. And overarching, more important than any of that, I think, in this period, is cost of living and the housing crisis. You look at, and there's good political science research on this, when people are finding it hard to stretch their paycheck from 1 month to the next, they blame the incumbent government. That's why we're seeing Rishi Sunak is struggling right now in the United Kingdom and is likely to lose the election. Joe Biden is having a hard time. So partisans can argue about how responsible Justin Trudeau is for inflation, but there's no arguing about the fact that that's like a kind of weight on his feet now, holding him down.
When I look at, you mentioned the Aga Khan's Island, and there was a point near the end of the book that I found quite interesting where you talk about how vacations have always been a blind spot for this government. And Trudeau himself, you had asked him about the cost of living issue, and you almost seemed like you caught him off guard with it. He was like, oh yeah, fair enough. But he really defends this. And it seems like even his own staff were very frustrated with this from the sense that I got.
And I am not entirely unsympathetic to him in that when you're writing something, you try to understand how they see the world. He grew up going to these kinds of places. The most recent controversy was around his trip to a resort in Jamaica, where he's been going since he was in diapers. And there isn't the same kind of ethical question there about, the conflict of interest code. The people, like old family friends, said, go ahead and stay at this place.
Yeah,
And
genuine family friends, not in that like sort of strained Aga Khan family friend way.
no, that's right. These people, they grew up going to that beach together when they were kids. And so on a personal level, he wants to go there and share that with his own kids. And I understand that. That's his personal life. But if he is making the argument that he is better positioned than Pierre Poilievre to grapple with the kind of cost of living issues that are affecting so many Canadians, people standing in line in the grocery store wondering if they have enough money to buy, the roast beef that they want to get for dinner. So that's the overwhelming preconception of his government, or ought to be. And here he is taking a free trip to a gorgeous resort paid for by rich buddies, right? So you can't help but think, well, that's frustrating for the people who are making sacrifices to get him elected, who believe in him, believe in his vision of the country, are afraid of Pierre Poilievre coming to power. So that's the dynamic that I try to describe. I don't try to judge him personally. He's I can see why he would want to go to that place. It looks very nice. you know
It seemed, I mean, my theory early on in Trudeau's time as leader, certainly, and as prime minister, was that the people around him didn't really see any weaknesses in him. Is that he genuinely had this godlike quality, it seemed like, and I maybe you disagree with that, and if you do, please let me know. But I'm wondering if you got the sense that the perception that the people around him have of him has changed over the last 10 years.
Oh, I'm sure it has. But I don't think I agree with that, because to me, one of the strengths of Justin Trudeau in that early phase from 2013, when he wins the leadership of the Liberal Party, until some later period, is that he had a great deal of promise, but he was undisciplined, and he didn't. And by undisciplined, I don't mean that he would be not doing what he was advised to do. I mean that his mind was kind of undisciplined. He hadn't been through all the partisan scrapes that someone like Pierre Poilievre has now. And he really worked closely with those advisors, with Katie Telford and Gerald Butts, Robert Asselin. And I think that if he had not done that work, media coaching, working on his speaking, that he would not have got where he was. And, when he said something dumb, he would sometimes go to his people after the interview and say, frankly, I shouldn't have said that, should I? And they'd say, no, that's right. Here's what you should have said. So he was doing the work. And I think that he did take advice, but he would not be the first politician on this vacation thing to reject advice from staff when it comes to private time. And that's conservatives and liberals and New Democrats, that these people, their lives are so difficult and they don't have any time to themselves and their families. And every now and then they say, well, I'm not asking your advice about this because this is about my family and what we're going to do over the holidays.
So when you look at your time here, and I want to ask you a little bit about the process and the access in a moment, but what is your central thesis, if you have one, about Justin Trudeau and his basically his story as prime minister?
Well, it's that he's a princely sort of character. He's different from other politicians. If you look at the previous successful prime ministers in the last decades, you have Jean Chrétien, Brian Mulroney, Stephen Harper, people who won more than one government. And they're all, in a sense, kind of similar figures in that they do not come from the halls of power. They are intensely driven people who, through hard work and guile and careful study of the art of politics, managed to win government and retain it through multiple elections. Whereas Justin Trudeau was born with a connection to the people of Canada. And that was his great strength in that Liberal leadership contest in that 2015 election, that Canadians felt they knew him. Fred Delory, who worked for Mr. Harper and then for Mr. O'Toole, described him as the son of Canada. The Canadians really felt at that time that they knew him and wanted to give him a chance, which was so that makes him different from all these other people. And I think of it as sort of paired qualities. He has princely courage. Certainly, you look at that boxing match, that was a brave thing to do. Princely charisma, princely confidence, but also princely vanity, princely capriciousness, a princely sense of entitlement. So that you look at him and I do, and think, well, that sets him apart. That's a frame of a way to think about him.
You raise, I think, an interesting point, and you have this quote that was, I gather, relayed to you secondhand through David Hurley in the book, where Justin Trudeau said to Hurley, David, I've always known my whole life that this would be available to me if I want, referring to the premiership of Canada. And that strikes me as one of the great contrasts, just to go back to the dueling books here, between Pierre Poilievre, say, and Justin Trudeau. Is that in the case of Pierre Poilievre, you could make a case that his life has been working towards this moment of becoming Canada's prime minister. Whereas for Justin Trudeau, it was one door that if he wanted to, he could open it and walk through it. And he did. But it was almost as though what I take from that quote, and I may be reading too much into it, is that Justin Trudeau didn't really feel like he needed this. He didn't really feel like it was necessarily a given even. It was just, if he wanted to, it would be there and he could go to it when it was convenient.
I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it. I don't think he was referring to the premiership then, but to the leadership of the Liberal Party.
Yeah. Sorry, to political aspiration. Yes.
Yes, that's right. And that was a door that was waiting for him in a sense. And this is a thing I find interesting about Trudeau, is that he is so accustomed to scrutiny, to having people pay close attention to him from childhood, that he's developed a kind of ease. He may even overshare at times. So he's saying that to Hurley. But I see that in his earlier interviews, he was just sort of accustomed to talking about himself in quite an open way. And that's an example of that. And in a sense, it's just the fact. It was there waiting for him, as it would be to say Ben Mulroney. If Ben Mulroney decided that he wanted to seek a seat in the Conservative Party of Canada, there would be people would be very interested in that. We saw that with Carolyn Mulroney. So in a sense, it's not that damning, I don't think, but it is a contrast with Pierre Poilievre, who fits more into the mold of these other guys, Stephen Harper, Jean Chrétien, Brian Mulroney, a guy from, an outsider who has had to find a way to get closer to the inside.
One thing that's been interesting in following the Trudeau government is the relative stability internally in the inner ranks, in the inner circle. And obviously that's not to say there hasn't been movement, but the idea of having a chief of staff who's been there for the entirety of the government, despite all the scandals that have rocked that government, is quite something. So how has that managed to happen? I mean, how has Katie Telford been there as long as she has without interruption? And how has, in general, that circle around him shifted or not shifted in the last decade?
So you have a core small group of people led by Katie Telford, and they have been together from the very beginning, right? I describe in the book this big meeting that took place in Mont-Tremblant, a Quebec ski resort, where Butts and Katie and Sacha Trudeau and David Hurley and a whole bunch of other Liberals got together and said, okay, what kind of campaign should we run? And so she's been by his side all through that period. And she's, by all accounts, a very talented person, a savvy political operative. Early on, you had the sense that Gerald was sort of the strategist and Katie the implementer. But obviously, after Butts leaves, that's no longer the case. and you have some other people. Brian Clough is very important. Zita Astravaz, although she left recently. Jeremy Broadhurst, and the sense that I get from people who've been around them and worked with them and seen them in various circumstances is these people are good at what they do. They have good judgment. They're good operators. They know politics. They're high achievers. A critique, and I think it's well founded, is that because of Trudeau's sort of lack of comfort with a larger group, or those people's lack of comfort with a larger group, files get jammed up in the hands of that small group of kind of trusted people close to Justin, so that the government is not as effective as it can be. And I think that that's a reasonable critique, and not particularly harsh to these staffers who I think are going in and probably doing their best every day.
So I think Pierre Poilievre's relationship with the media has obviously been a source of interest, given how differently he approaches it from even conservative leaders past. I think Justin Trudeau's relationship with the media is interesting for different reasons. I know that he had made that crack at the Parliamentary Press Gallery dinner. I can't remember how many years ago, but basically about how, the $600 million that he gave them was buying them off. And I know some in the press gallery were actually a bit uncomfortable with that joke. But did Trudeau take the media for granted as being on his side early on in his term?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, at first, that first year, there was a sort of pleasure in the land. Not everywhere, obviously, not in Calgary or Medicine Hat, but in a lot of the country, there was a feeling of
Sunny ways.
sunny ways, and they were doing things, right? They were doing
Mhm.
things that made people happy. They were doing things they promised to do, that they were elected to do. So I'm not sure that there was a it was a honeymoon, but governments deserve a honeymoon if they're proceeding with what they've said they would do.
Well, and unlike, just to contrast it with Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau came in on a majority, so he had a much greater toolkit available to him than the Conservatives did in 2006.
Yes, that's right. And there was a lot of pent up frustration with the Harper government on a number of different files. So for the among progressive Canadians. So for the first year, Justin Trudeau and his people were able to hit the items that they promised to do, and just get good points from their own people by reversing things that Harper had done. But I didn't feel like the media was particularly soft on him. At the beginning of the so the honeymoon ended with the Aga Khan trip, but earlier than that, there was Elbowgate when he hit NDP MP Ruth Ellen Brasseux in the chest with his elbow on the floor of the House of Commons and had to apologize. And I remember that being covered aggressively. You mentioned the media bailout. I find it kind of painful that the Canadians are so suspicious of the media now because of these bailouts. And I also understand, and I suspect you would not agree with me, but that the government was in a bit of a pickle here, in that they were looking at the real prospect of the Toronto Star and Post Media going out of business, and the expansion of news deserts, which I find alarming. I've been in the newspaper business and magazines for most of my life, and several of the papers where I used to work are now gone, right? And they're not being served by other outlets. So I suspect I see that somewhat differently, but
Yeah, you do. And I mean, I did an interview with Jen Gerson not that long ago, and we talked about this, and Jen had said the part out loud that a lot of people are uncomfortable saying, which is that we have to get acquainted with the idea and comfortable with the idea of collapse, because there's no incentive to come up with the business model that works if something doesn't die. But to your point, I realized that that's a high stakes game, and that as much as I'm very happy that True North for example, is doing something that's working for us. I also realize that we do need a diverse media landscape. So I don't have the answer to it, but I also am I'm very much on team no bailout, which I suspect we could have
And
another
you're in
debate
good
on.
company. If I can say, you're in good company on that team. And
Okay.
I don't feel that the people who express that view are against Canada or anything. I see the reason why they would have felt the pressure to
Mhm.
prevent this kind of disaster from happening.
One of the great contrasts between the Liberals and Conservatives, and by great I don't mean positive, I just mean stark, has been the way that they treat their leaders. The Conservatives, I feel, are far more. Well, I don't even think it's a feeling. I think it's bears out empirically. The Conservatives are ruthless with their leaders in a way that the Liberals clearly are not. I mean, I mentioned on my show earlier this week that a Hill Times interview with Liberal MP Sean Casey, where he wouldn't even give an answer on whether he thinks Justin Trudeau should lead the party into the next election, which is about as forceful as it gets from this Liberal caucus about Justin Trudeau. There's no criticism. We don't see the knives. We don't see the movements against them. And I'm curious, and I know you spoke to Liberal MPs for your book here. What is the read quietly? Because I mean, even before poll numbers started to show the Liberals headed towards a collapse, I'm sure there were some frustrations on some issues, but he has kept an iron grip on that caucus. And that goes back to the very beginning. The caucus loyalty that exists to Justin Trudeau seems significant and just completely foreign to what happens in conservative politics in this country. What do those MPs tell you?
So I would make 2 points. One, that they know very well that things are not going well. I have a quote from an MP in my book who's saying every MP in the Liberal Party is hearing it from longtime Liberals, often people who really like Justin Trudeau and are glad at what he's done, but they're saying it's time for him to move on, right? Like that's the clear enough message. Uh, but the other thing about the knives coming out, I don't remember knives coming out for Stephen Harper when he was leading a government that was trailing in the polls during that last year in office. And I think that there's a similar reason why in the Harper case and the Trudeau case, these gentlemen created the modern Conservative Party and the modern Liberal Party. Our politics has become so leader focused that it's not like the old days where you would have someone like Lucien Bouchard leading an important contingent of the Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservative Party. There is just the leader now. You don't have regional chieftains in the same old way. So all of these people, almost all of the people in Justin Trudeau's caucus are elected because he got them elected.
One of the things I'm interested in your take on, and I suspect it's probably very different from what my audience wants to hear, but I think it's also helpful because you did cover this extensively, is Trudeau's handling of COVID, and I'll say more specifically the Freedom Convoy, because I suspected that the Emergencies Act would have been more controversial within the Liberal Party than it openly was. And I know there was some quiet dissent and frustration, but for the most part, again, everyone fell in line and went on it. But what is your overarching read? And I know it's a big question on that chapter of Trudeau's tenure as Prime Minister.
Well, I'm waiting to see what the Supreme Court of Canada says. There have been two judges now, Justice Rouleau and Justice Mosley, both of whom sort of assessed the constitutionality of what he did. And I would point out, so they came to different conclusions. Justice Rouleau said that it was constitutional.
Mm-hmm.
Justice Mosley said it wasn't. I would point out that both men said they understood that there are two ways of looking at this and that it was a very difficult circumstance for the government. So that's kind of how I look at it is I was glad at the Mosley decision because I think that at the time of the convoy, and I would guess your listeners are not in this group, but a lot of the people who I knew were having a hellish time of it in downtown Ottawa, right? They did not support the convoy. They were not opposed to mandates, and their city was under siege, and they couldn't sleep. Right? Imagine having a newborn or an older relative with dementia in those circumstances, with horns going all night and whatnot. Like, it's a police failure, and the government was forced to act. That's my view. I suspect that people watching this are strongly disagreeing, but that's what I think. And so the government needed to do something. I think that the question of whether they went too far, in particular with freezing bank accounts, which had an impact on spouses and other relatives who had really nothing to do with the convoy, and whether they went too far in stopping people from demonstrating. I would say I don't see it as a sign of imminent civil disobedience in Canada. There was nobody killed. Any injuries were fairly minor. We had a huge, big demonstration in Ottawa, and at some level, I think that we can take comfort from the fact that, unlike on January 6th in Washington, nobody was killed, and we managed to bumble through it as Canadians, even though we don't necessarily agree. We got through it.
It took on a life of its own, and was sort of, cheekily reclaimed by the people who were in the crosshairs of the comment. But when Justin Trudeau made that remark about the fringe minority, people with unacceptable views, this was a departure from what his outward approach had been through the rest of the pandemic, which was Team Canada. We all got to unite. We all got to stick together. And I think he was being very honest there. I don't know if it was poll tested or anything, but I think he was speaking in a way that was very genuine to him. Does he hold his critics in contempt, in your view? Because that's been always how it's looked. And during COVID, that was certainly the perception that was taken up by me at some points, and certainly by members of the audience, with comments he made in that one interview in Quebec, and certainly in the fringe minority comment.
Yeah, so I believe that was unwise for Mr. Trudeau to be so provocative in attacking the people of the convoy, and I make that point in my book. I thought that Joël Lightbound, the Quebec MP, a Liberal MP, who spoke against that, was correct, and it was wrong. I think that Trudeau was actually forced, or felt forced, to come out with this kind of messaging because he had to polarize around the mandates. They were in terrible difficulty during that election campaign, and were at risk of losing it to Aaron O'Toole. And the polling showed the way out for the Liberals was to put mandates front and center, partly because it exposed division and weakness on the Conservative side, where you had a distance between the view that Mr. O'Toole had and the view held by Westerners like Chris Workington and Andrew Scheer. So, I can see how he found himself doing that, Trudeau, but I think it was bad for the country. It led to these painful divisions that will likely outlast him. I find it painful to think of how people who were opposed to mandates ended up feeling that they'd been scapegoated by their own government.
I wanted to ask you about the access you got. You actually had greater access to the Liberals than I had to the Conservatives in some respect, because you actually were able to speak with Justin Trudeau for this. And I've been asked in interviews for my book why Pierre Poilievre didn't speak to me, which I think is a fair question. So I'll ask you the inverse of that. Why do you think Justin Trudeau did speak to you?
I think it was wise for him to speak to me. And he and his people are quite astute, and there were a number of things that I wanted to ask him about to get his voice and his perspective on them, and basically sprinkle them throughout this book, which was largely completed by the time of the interview. So it made for a better book, and it allowed him to put his voice and explain himself into it. I'm not sure it was a black and white decision for them. It only happened at the very end. I'm sure that they did not look at this prospect of this book and think, "Oh, great, that'll be good for us."
And was it just the one interview?
Just one interview,
And
yes,
how
and
long was it?
for 1 hour.
So you had to be very selective in what you put to him, I suspect.
Yes, and I did not. If I'd had several hours, I'd have loved to have said, "Well, let's relax and talk about SNC Lavalin for 20 minutes." But I did not believe that that would be helpful because, you know, um, something that I've learned over the years from doing interviews is that if you put people on the defensive, particularly practiced senior politicians like the Prime Minister, they have a whole collection of little recorded messages, and that stuff is of no use to anyone. So I tried to ask questions that would not have him reaching for those little sound clips that he's sort of trained to produce.
You talk about the foreign interference scandal, and I suspect that you were up against this problem here of writing this book and finding you have to keep changing the book because of the news cycle, and I think that's a challenge with writing about any contemporary figure. But I'm curious, and there's a line I'll read here. When you talk about if I pull it up here. I lost the page, but basically you talk about the way that this issue really affected the agenda for the government. And I was wondering if you could just extrapolate on that a bit.
Well, yeah, it threw them off. There was a caucus retreat in Montreal, if memory serves, where it was seen as a reset. Right? They've been struggling to reset. They keep trying to sort of find their feet and make progress politically, and are struggling. And the people doing the leaking, whom some of them must be actual current members of our security services or recently retired members, which I sometimes think, made it impossible for the government to ever put this issue behind them until such time as they called what I thought we needed, which was a public inquiry into foreign interference. It's one issue that, because of the secrecy involved, I felt somewhat frustrated by my inability to tell readers really what this is all about. But I was left with, and I continue to have, serious questions. I don't know. I'm not impressed by the government's handling of this issue. I don't know why we haven't had already for several years a foreign agent registry. We ought to have done that. I think we will get it, and we need it. And it's one of the least impressive files for this government. And it kept throwing them off because it kept wrestling the headlines back to that. And I hope we're going to see progress on a registry and a sense that the government is taking this seriously.
I'll ask just in closing about this one section near the end of the book. You say Trudeau has used sunny ways as promised, but they have not convinced Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe to collect the carbon tax as required by law, or Danielle Smith, for instance, to abandon a plan to withdraw her province from the Canada Pension Plan. And he never seemed to know how to handle Francois Legault, whose nationalistic leadership of Quebec poses a challenge to the rights of linguistic and religious minorities around which the Liberal Party has traditionally built its brand. Trudeau's relationship with the Federation is very different now than it was a decade ago. How much of that is Justin Trudeau, in your view, or how much of it is changes in the provinces that have just coincided almost coincidentally with where we are now?
That's a good question. I'm a little worried when you think about. I'm a little worried about national unity in the state of the Federation. When you look at Pierre Trudeau and his reckoning with Peter Lougheed, who was the premier of Alberta in his day, Lougheed was very much forthright about thinking about Canada, and they had their fights, and Albertans were angry about the National Energy Program, rightly, I think, in retrospect. But the gulf was not as large as it is between Danielle Smith and Justin Trudeau. It's a difficult country to govern, and I worry sometimes that it's getting more difficult as the media environment becomes more fragmented, and Albertans feel less a part of a federation than they have. Some of that is a temporary thing that would change with a change in government. We've had this argument over resources that is in a sense insoluble, because people in Western Canada just feel that, like, it's terrible and wrong that anyone is trying to limit the expansion of the resource industry there. And a lot of people in Eastern Canada feel we've got to do something to tackle emissions, and there's no way to do that without limiting the growth of the oil sands. So stay tuned. It seems like it's a difficult file to wrestle with.
What's one thing that you learned that stands out or that surprised you in writing this?
There was one moment that I thought was interesting, just a minor thing, but that when Mr. Trudeau back in 2015 was traveling through southwestern Ontario, and they got news that La Presse, the big Montreal daily, had endorsed him, and with a very kind editorial that compared him to Laurier and said Canada needs him now, that he wept in the bus in front of his staff. And when I asked him about that during my interview, his eyes teared up again. That sense of how emotional he was about his relationship with the people of Quebec. He was seen, Quebecers have a very complicated relationship with his father, who was kind of revered but also despised. And Trudeau struggled to be taken seriously. So I found that an interesting moment, kind of just the emotion of it, that he had been accepted by his own people, and that was it was kind of nice in a way.
All right. Well, it's a very fascinating book, The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau. Like I said, it's great fun that we get to be coming out the same day with two different characters in Canadian politics, but both, I think, tremendously relevant. Stephen Maher, congratulations on the book, and thank you for your time today.
I want to congratulate you on your book, Andrew. I could just as easily be interviewing you if I had a podcast. Congratulations. It's people are excited about it, and it must have been a lot of hard work, and good for you. So thank you.
I think Amazon's already recommending them to the buyers of each other. So hopefully it'll rise together better than sinking together. So Stephen, I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Bye now.
That does it for us for today. We'll be back tomorrow with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show here, the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to the Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.